December 5th, 1941. Manila, Philippines. The city was alive with tension, yet the streets seemed strangely quiet. The air was thick with uncertainty, the murmurs of an impending storm barely audible beneath the cacophony of a bustling metropolis. The Pacific was about to boil over, and no one could predict what was to come. There were whispers in the halls of power about a great war, but for many, it felt like a distant echo, something they couldn't quite grasp, a fate that still seemed too far removed from the everyday routines of life in Manila. Inside the dimly lit office of a small, cluttered building on the outskirts of the city, Anita Del Rosario sat at her desk, her fingers moving rapidly over the worn keys of a typewriter. The soft clicking sound of the machine was the only noise that punctuated the stillness around her. Her office was a small, nondescript room, far from the grand halls of military power, but it was here that she had been given an extraordinary responsibility. A responsibility no one else seemed to understand, not even her superiors. She had been working as a civilian clerk for the U.S. Army intelligence since the start of the year. Her job wasn't glamorous. She typed reports, filed papers, and sent messages across a complicated network of channels. It was tedious, unimportant work in the eyes of most. But there was something different about Anita, something that set her apart from the others who came and went from the office. She had a quiet intensity about her, a razor-sharp focus and a deep understanding of the broader situation unfolding around her. Her training had not prepared her for what she would soon uncover. There was no way to predict the magnitude of what she would see or the vital role she would come to play in the days ahead. She had been taught to follow orders and keep her head down. But when the first reports of strange movements in the Pacific surfaced, something inside her stirred. It wasn't just the usual chatter. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut, the pressure building, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. What she was witnessing went far beyond ordinary reports. These were signs of something far more sinister. One late evening, as the office emptied out and the building fell quiet, Anita stayed behind, her fingers skimming through a stack of telegrams, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead accompanying her movements. The words on the page blurred together. There was a pattern she couldn't ignore, coded messages that made no sense to anyone else. It was only by chance, or perhaps fate, that she recognized them for what they were, warnings. With every line she typed, every report she filed, a piece of the puzzle fell into place. She saw how the various pieces of information, seemingly innocuous on their own, were starting to form a clear picture. There was talk of troop movements, new military orders, and coded transmissions. Each line she typed brought her closer to a terrifying realization. The Japanese were preparing for something big. It was going to happen soon. But no one seemed to care. When she shared her suspicions with her superiors, they dismissed her concerns. "It's just routine," they said. "Nothing to worry about." These men, who were supposed to know everything, who were supposed to have the answers, didn't see what Anita saw. They were blinded by bureaucracy, too consumed by their own priorities to notice the cracks in the wall. Their eyes were trained on the wrong threats, their focus too narrow to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding right in front of them. Anita tried again and again. She typed up more reports, hoping that with each one, someone might finally pay attention. She decoded the messages, trying to make them clearer, more urgent. Yet the replies she received were always the same: dismissive, patronizing, unbothered. The higher-ups were too wrapped up in their own administrative duties to understand the gravity of what she was uncovering. How could they? They were too far removed from the front lines, too far from the chaos, to understand the patterns she was piecing together. Her hands shook as she typed out another urgent report. This one was different. It wasn't just a warning about troop movements or strange transmissions. No, this one was a direct alert about the most dangerous and insidious possibility: a surprise attack. The kind of attack that no one would see coming, the kind that would leave them unprepared and vulnerable. She knew, deep in her bones, that it was only a matter of time before the Japanese launched an assault. And when they did, it would be catastrophic. The problem was that she didn't know how to make anyone believe her. How do you convince people to act on something they don't want to hear? How do you convince them that the world they live in is about to change in ways they can't imagine? She was just a woman behind a desk with a typewriter. No one would listen to her. And yet, she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't ignore the warning bells ringing in her mind. She had to act. She had to do something, anything, to get the message across. But the more she typed, the more isolated she felt. It was as though she was shouting into the void, her words falling on deaf ears. Every day, as she sent her reports, she watched as they disappeared into the vast bureaucratic machine. No one seemed to notice. As the days passed, Anita began to feel a deep sense of foreboding. The fear that had once been a quiet whisper in her mind was now a constant companion. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a cliff, peering into an abyss. The world around her was on the brink of something unthinkable, and she, of all people, was the only one who seemed to see it. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The world exploded into chaos, and the Pacific War was suddenly upon them. Everything Anita had feared, everything she had written, had come true. The attack was swift, brutal, and completely unexpected. It was the kind of strike that left no room for doubt. The enemy had been watching, waiting, and now they had struck. As the news spread through Manila, Anita sat in her office, her hands still trembling from the weight of what had just happened. She could hardly breathe, the air heavy with shock and disbelief. The words she had typed, the warning she had tried to issue, now seemed so small, so insignificant in the face of the devastation unfolding across the ocean. She had tried, but it was too late. The world had already turned, and there was no going back. But as the dust settled and the war began to unfold in all its horror, Anita's role in those early warnings remained a shadow, lost in the cracks of history. Her name was never mentioned in the reports. The documents she had painstakingly typed and sent out, the ones that had warned of the attack, were buried, forgotten. The military hierarchy moved on, the war machine spinning forward, and the ones who had seen it coming were left in the margins, their warnings ignored and their voices silenced. Yet Anita knew. She knew that in those quiet moments, behind the walls of that unremarkable office, she had been the one to see it first. She had been the one who understood the danger when no one else did. And though history would never remember her as a hero, she would always know the truth, that a woman with nothing but a typewriter had seen the storm coming, even when the world refused to listen. Her courage was not celebrated. Her warnings went unheard. But the war had begun, and in a way, it had begun with her. February 9th, 1942. Aboard the USS Lexington, the skies above the Pacific were a canvas of soft blues and grays, a deceptive calm that hid the fury brewing beneath. War had descended upon the oceans with a violence that no one could have imagined just months earlier. The Pacific, once a place of trade and exploration, had turned into a vast expanse of blood and fire. The Japanese had struck hard and fast, and now the Allies were reeling, struggling to respond to a well-planned assault that had caught them entirely off guard. But the fight was far from over, and there were still people on the fringes, people who, though dismissed by the establishment, had a different view of the battlefield. On the USS Lexington, a carrier currently stationed far from the shorelines of Manila, a small group of military officers were poring over maps and intercepted messages, some of which had come from the same reports Anita del Rosario had typed, though no one knew her name. Their task was to connect the dots, find the patterns, and decode the vast network of intelligence the enemy had so carefully woven. But the men and women gathered around this table were far from the brass hats of the high command. They were the outsiders, the ones who didn't fit into the neat lines of military hierarchy. They weren't the celebrated tacticians who'd been born into privilege or earned their ranks through decades of service. No, they were the ones who were often ignored, overlooked, or worse, pushed aside. Some were young officers, still proving themselves in the harsh world of war. Others were civilians, former academics, or analysts who had been recruited for their ability to see what others missed. Together, They formed a team that was both unconventional and unstoppable. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, a Navy intelligence officer with a quick mind but little respect among his peers, was the one who had pieced together the first fragment of the puzzle. It wasn't much, a single word hidden in an intercepted radio message, a word that seemed insignificant at first glance. But Hayes knew better. It wasn't about what was said. It was about what wasn't said. The careful silence in the message spoke volumes. And once he shared his hunch with the others, they dug deeper, searching for the meaning behind that single word. What do we know about their tactics? Hayes asked, leaning over a map, his fingers tracing the lines of the Pacific Ocean. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. They move fast, and they're coordinated. It's not just brute force, they're smart. His team nodded, the sense of urgency palpable in the room. They had already witnessed the devastation at Pearl Harbor, and the intelligence they'd gathered since then painted a picture of a highly organized, disciplined enemy. But there was something else, something more elusive. It wasn't just the way the Japanese forces were striking. It was the way they were avoiding detection, slipping through the cracks of Allied intelligence, as though they knew exactly where to go and when. "I think we're missing something," said Ensign Claire Bishop, a cryptographer whose ability to decipher enemy codes had earned her a place at the table. She had spent hours breaking down the codes and signals coming from Japan, but now she was struggling. "It's like they're using a different language, one we haven't figured out yet. It's not just a matter of translating their words. We need to understand how they think." "That's it," said Hayes, his voice suddenly sharp with realization. "We're looking at this all wrong. We're focusing on what they're saying, not what they're doing. There's a difference. Think about it." Hayes continued, his eyes narrowing as he traced a line across the map. "The Japanese don't just attack. They move in a pattern. They make deliberate choices. And they do it under the radar. They hide in plain sight." The others exchanged glances, sensing they were on the brink of something important. Hayes had been right about the message, and his hunch was beginning to take shape. But it wasn't enough to have a theory. They needed to act, and fast. The team worked late into the night, poring over every scrap of information they had. They knew time was running out. The Japanese had already taken Guam, and the Philippines was under siege. The air was thick with the tension of knowing they were fighting against an enemy who had the advantage, who had struck first, and who was using methods that seemed to outpace the Allies at every turn. Despite their exhaustive work, they had little to go on. Their resources were limited. But there was one thing that kept them going, the belief that they had the advantage of insight. They had a clearer picture than anyone else, even if no one wanted to listen to them. Hours turned into days. Exhausted eyes flickered over maps. Radios hummed with the sounds of encrypted signals, and the team continued to piece together the fragmented intelligence. In their isolation, they had become the last line of defense against the tide of war. They were outsiders, but in that moment, they were also the only ones who seemed to understand what was at stake. "We have a shot at this," said Claire, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief as the breakthrough finally came. She had cracked another code, one that seemed to confirm their suspicions. It was a signal sent by the Japanese fleet, and buried within its layers was a warning. The enemy was planning something even bigger, something that would hit at the heart of the Allied forces in the Pacific. Hayes took the decoded message in his hands and studied it intently. It was more than just a confirmation of their earlier findings. It was a blueprint of the next major strike, a move that could cripple the Allied forces and solidify Japan's dominance in the Pacific. But the challenge now was getting this information to the right people. They couldn't rely on the usual channels. The higher-ups in the military hierarchy had already dismissed them, written them off as outcasts. And yet, it was these very outcasts who held the key to stopping the Japanese advance. They sent their report through covert channels, bypassing the traditional military structures that had consistently failed to recognize their value. They didn't care if their message was ignored. They knew the truth. The information was critical. Whether anyone would listen was another matter. By the time the message reached higher command, it was almost too late. The Japanese had already begun their preparations. But something had shifted. Thanks to the efforts of this small, disparate team, a warning had been issued, and the gears of response were slowly turning. In the weeks that followed, the intelligence team's predictions would prove startlingly accurate. The Japanese were indeed preparing for another strike, a strike that would eventually be thwarted, though at great cost. But for the moment, as the team waited anxiously aboard the Lexington, there was no guarantee of success. The war was still unfolding, and though they had uncovered something monumental, they were still very much on the outside looking in. They had uncovered a truth no one else had seen, and they had done so in the face of rejection and skepticism. But even now, as they sat in their makeshift command post, there was still the nagging feeling that they might never be fully recognized for their work. In the end, the war would shift, the tides would turn, and victories would come. But the names of those who had fought on the fringes, those who had decoded the enemy's language, would remain unspoken. History would forget their role, but they would know. They would always know that it was their insight, their courage, and their willingness to stand against the tide of institutional indifference that had made the difference. As the USS Lexington sailed onward, the crew continued to move through the war, step by step, mile by mile, with the weight of their secret knowledge, a secret that could change everything, but only if anyone was willing to listen. July 19th, 1945. Washington, D.C. The war was almost over. The world was already shifting its gaze from the horrors of the battlefield to the possibilities of peace. In Europe, victory had been achieved months ago, and the tides of battle were finally turning in the Pacific. The Japanese Empire was on the brink of collapse, its forces stretched thin, its morale broken. The United States and its allies had gained ground, but the price had been steep, and many stories remained hidden in the folds of history. Amidst the post-war celebrations and the rebuilding of the world, there was a quiet reckoning occurring in the shadows. For Anita del Rosario, there was no parade, no medals, no recognition. She had played a pivotal role in the early stages of the war. Her warnings had been dismissed, her intelligence ignored, and yet she had seen what no one else could. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, her typed reports and decoded messages had become the whispers of history, left to fade in the dust of bureaucracy. Her name, so carefully kept from the spotlight, was buried in forgotten archives, her courage never celebrated. She was a footnote, an invisible woman in a world that had moved on. But the world was wrong to forget her, because in those early days, when the world was blind to the storm brewing in the Pacific, Anita had been the one to see it, and she had tried to warn them. The words she had typed out, the warning she had passed along, had been ignored, dismissed as irrelevant in the face of a larger war effort. Yet the information she provided had been crucial. The patterns she had identified had been the key to anticipating the Japanese advance. She had seen it coming, and she had acted.